James Bamford discusses the history of National Security Agency spying and the NSA surveillance of American citizens since 9/11. He also talks about NSA leaker Edward Snowden and the current lawsuit being brought against the agency by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. This is about an hour, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate everybody coming here. This is a really great event. But it's only the second greatest event I've had here. Right through those doors, I was married a few years ago, so this has to take second place to that, I think. And among the people at my wedding, which I discovered later, was the major Russian spy, Bob Hansen, who I had known for years as one of my sources, and I didn't realize what his avocation was. So. But it's really good to have you all here. I was very happy that the president decided to hold off on his announcement till tomorrow so he could hear what I have to say tonight. That was very nice of him. I don't think he's probably going to agree with most of what I have to say, but I'd be interested to hear what he has to say tomorrow. One of the things that's really fascinating is how many people actually know about NSA today. I mean, everybody here. When I first wrote The Puzzle Palace back in 1982. I was doing a book tour, and one of the people on the book tour, or at least in the limousine going to the studio, was Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey. And he said, well, what's your book about? And I said, it's about NSA, the National Security Agency. And he said, what's that? So we got on the set, and he was there to talk about the economy. I was there to talk about NSA. And I just couldn't resist it when the host asked me, how secret is NSA? And I said, well, even Senator Bradley said he'd never heard of it. And he got really angry. He took a separate car back to the hotel that night. And then the next day, his aide called up and says, that was really below the belt to say that. And I said, no, below the belt was saying he probably confused it with the NBA. So I heard he went on the intelligence committee, though, after our get-together. So he knew a lot more about NSA than I did after that. One other thing that was really funny when the book first came out was that the book was picked by Book of the Month Club. And so I got the New York Times Book Review, and on the back they have all these little pictures of these little books that make the little pictures of the books that make the Book of the Month Club. So I saw mine, the name was there, The Puzzle Palace, but the picture was different. It was a picture of a rocket taking up or something. And then we called up and they said, well, what was the idea of doing this? And they said, well, we thought you were talking about NASA. So they changed the cover of my book on the Book of the Month Club because they thought I made a mistake. So but anyway, John wanted me to keep this fairly short because we got a lot of people with a lot of questions, and the questions are going to be far more interesting than the talk. So but I thought I'd run through a few interesting things here. First of all, I'm really happy to be in the Press Club. Press Club has been a member here for over 30 years now. Let me go to my first slide. I was actually a member when they, actually not at the time, but later on. This was actually an all-men's place until 1971, I think it was. But the person up on the, up there that has a deck of cards or a hand of cards in front of him was an old-time Press Club member. He'd hang out here during the 1950s, and he became a really fascinating card shark. And he wrote a book called Education of a Poker Player. And that's we're still in the original building, so he may have been playing cards here. But before he became a card shark, he had another job. And that was being the founding father of the National Security Agency. The NSA actually got its start in that little apartment building there in July 1920. And Herbert Yardley was the chief of the Black Chamber, that's what it was called. And he lived on the top floor with his family, and the first floor was a phony company. It was a company that supposedly made commercial codes, but it was just a front. And the actual code breaking was done on the two middle floors. So as you can imagine, the NSA has grown a fair amount since those days. But what some of us are, at least some people have been saying right now, happened actually in 1929. And that was the Secretary of State came along, Secretary of State Simpson, and Yardley didn't want to tell him that there was a thing called the Black Chamber, even though his State Department was paying for it. Because he didn't know what his reaction would be, that there's a secret little office up in New York that is eavesdropping on communications. And then he did finally tell him, and Simpson was outraged, and he yelled, "Gentlemen, do not read each other's mail," and he immediately closed down the Black Chamber. Well, that put Yardley out of work. So then Yardley went from being the head of the Black Chamber, the head of the organization that was the first predecessor of the NSA, to becoming the basically the Edward Snowden of his day. Snowden, who today has become the object of, is he a hero or is he a traitor? And my answer to that is always he's a very heroic whistleblower. There's no connection between Snowden, as far as I'm concerned, and spies. I know spies. I've been writing about him. I had one at my weddings, I mentioned. Edward Snowden is not selling secrets to the Russians. He didn't go there to sell secrets to the Russians. He went there because the U.S. canceled his passport halfway between Hong Kong and Ecuador. But way before there was a Edward Snowden, there was Herbert Yardley. And Herbert Yardley, after they closed the Black Chamber, he decided to write a book about it, which was the very first expose of American cryptologic community. And they weren't very happy, obviously, of what they were when his book came out. And they tried putting him in jail, but they couldn't find a law. So they actually created a new part of the espionage law to prosecute him with. And a lot of that is what they're prosecuting, or trying to prosecute, threatening to prosecute Snowden with right now. But ironically, the first head of the NSA became also the first whistleblower. Now, this is something that I think Edward Snowden would be very interested in, because there's a history of this. There's a history, actually, which I'm going to show you in a little bit here, of at one point being a real big villain to the NSA, and the next minute being a hero to the NSA. So it took a while. It took almost 70 years, but they finally put Herbert Yardley in the Hall of Honor at NSA. So maybe there's still a chance for Ed Snowden at some point. But like I said, this isn't Yardley's book was the very first book written basically on the organization of the cryptologic organization, the predecessor to NSA. Then the next one to write was David Kahn, who wrote a book called The Codebreakers in 1967, which told a lot about NSA. It was the most, the biggest expose of NSA that had ever happened since Herbert Yardley. And the NSA went to a lot of trouble to try to get rid of the book. I mean, they even considered, this came out in the Senate Intelligence Committee report, surreptitious entry to his house to try to steal the manuscript, clandestine service applications, whatever that is, kidnapping, termination, whatever. And worst of all, they were going to plant some disparaging press reviews about his book, which as an author, you'd take every other option before that one. So, like Yardley, David Kahn was rehabilitated, and in 1995, they made him the first official scholar in residence at NSA. And then they took all his books, including the one that they were trying to ban, and they put it in the library. So again, more hope for Ed Snowden here. Then mine was the next one, the Puzzle Palace. And there they accused me of putting the country at risk. They threatened me twice with prosecution to give up, trying to force me to give up documents, which I never gave up. Raided a library where I did the research, ripped a lot of stuff out of the library. They threatened several of my sources, including a former NSA director, with prosecution and jail time and everything. They had a guy follow me. That's why I wore that. I wore a costume wherever I went. So So they, actually, that was a Halloween party at John Henry's house. So, but they did. They actually had they had somebody in every audience where I gave a talk from NSA taking notes, just in case I slipped up and said something they could put me in jail with. And they put a whole file cabinet of papers together on me. And I FOIA'd them. I submitted a free information request, and they said, "We don't have anything on you." And I said, "Well, that's impossible. I've been writing about you for 3 years. You've been after me for 3 years, and you don't have a single piece of paper." And then I saw on one paper, it said the word Esquire, and I figured, that's my code name. So I sent a request for everything on the Esquire file, and I got a whole drawer. And I get rehabilitated, too. So after about 20 years, the agency, yes, I just made that picture up there, but yes, they actually had a book signing for me at NSA, and they did have a line going out the door, and a lot of the people were actually carrying the puzzle pouch, which they were forbidden to carry even by before. And they invited me to speak to the National Cryptologic School, but I'm really recalcitrant, so I became a bad guy again. I wrote a really nasty book about NSA's eavesdropping, so I'm no longer on their official tour list anymore. But anyway, so there is a possibility here that this could be reality. You know, you get General Alexander holding a sign up saying Snowden's a hero, or wearing a hero T-shirt. I mean, it's all possible. Who knows? But before there was Snowden, there were other whistleblowers, and those are the people that I really admire, people that helped me in writing some of the books I did, some of the articles I did. Tom Drake, Bill Benny, Kurt Wiebe, Ed Loomis, they were all people who defied NSA. These were people who were working at NSA. They worked there for Bill Benny for almost 40 years, and Tom Drake had worked there as a contractor for a long time. Before that, he was in the military. And Tom Drake's first day on the job at NSA was September 11, 2001. But these are the people that I really admire, because they are people who have a conscience, and they. When 9/11 came along, and then the NSA began eavesdropping domestically, these are the people who spoke up, and they left the agency. They quit the agency because they didn't want to see the system they worked on turned into a vehicle for eavesdropping on American citizens in the U.S. So I've got a lot of admiration from them. They don't have the amount of attention that Snowden has, but they did an awful lot of work to help get the message out, and a few of them are here tonight, actually. Well, this is the NSA's gone a long ways, baby, since Herbert O. Yardley in the townhouse. I mean, now it's an entire city. I've been actually through there a few times, and it's just a mammoth location, and people have no idea how much that agency has grown just in the last 10 years. It's the complex itself, the headquarters complex itself, you could put the U.S. Capitol in there 4 times over and have space left over. So, and the whole purpose for this is eavesdropping. So it's an agency that really needs to have a close eye on, and that's why we're here, and that's why this controversy has come up, because there hasn't been a close eye on it. Here's the NSA's budget. For years, the NSA was, this is one of the top secret documents released by Snowden. For years, the NSA was the largest budget item in the intelligence community. But that changed more recently because of the advent of drones with the CIA and so forth. So, but it's an enormous amount of budget. You can see how much it's budgeted. And it's very widespread. This is one of the more revealing slides I've seen from the Snowden group. It shows where they do all their, they plant all their malware, where all the computers around the world, 50,000 places they plant malware, all the places where they tap into fiber optic cables and so forth. So for somebody who's been writing about NSA for a very, very long time, this was an extremely informative slide. Metadata, that's the big, nobody had ever heard of that word probably before last June, I think, but it's become really the key, one of the key issues we're talking about now, because I don't know about you, but I never gave the U.S. government, particularly the NSA, the authority to collect every time I pick up a telephone, to keep a record of that and to keep it for 5 years. So that's one of the big issues that's going to be talked about tomorrow at the President's talk, is whether he's going to go along with the committee's recommendation, his panel's recommendation, which is basically taking the NSA out of the business of storing all these records, and instead putting the data where it's supposed to be, where the companies are that collected it, and then using legal authority, getting a warrant from a judge to search through the data, and not just going through it without any without any oversight. Anyway, so metadata is a really big problem. One of the things that has come up more recently was these two decisions on the issue of metadata. One was Judge Richard Leon, a federal judge in Washington, and the other was Judge William Pauley in New York. I don't know if it made any difference, but I grew up with Judge Leon and went to law school with him. But we've never agreed on anything in 30 years. He's a very conservative judge, and the plaintiff is very conservative. So Judge Leon came to a very conservative conclusion, which happened to be the same conclusion I come to, which was a liberal conclusion, and that's that the government should not be able to do this kind of activity with metadata. Judge William Pauley came to the opposite conclusion. So you had that sort of split decision. I mean, in my opinion, you've just got to get rid of that whole idea of the government collecting metadata. I mean, the Snowden case is a perfect example of why. Here was Ed Snowden, who worked 6,000 miles from NSA. He was a contractor. He was in his 20s, and yet he was able to spend almost a year, it seems like, exfiltrating all the 1.7 million of the most secret documents from NSA. And NSA with not even knowing about it until he shows up in Hong Kong. So do you want to trust this agency with all your data? I don't particularly want to do that. You can see what happens with Target. I mean, there are people out there that really want data, that will pay a lot of money for it, and if somebody at NSA, instead of doing the honorable thing, which is being a whistleblower, want to be a criminal, they've got all that data. So the less you keep in the hands of the government, the better it is. But one of the key issues here, which is an issue I'll talk about a bit here, it's somewhat of a complex issue, but it's a key issue in the entire metadata discussion. It's the issue that Judge Pauley sort of hung his hat on his decision. And it all centers on this house in Yemen and this person up here, Khalid al-Mihdhar. I'll guarantee you I'm the only person in this room that has actually been to that house. This was bin Laden's operations center in Yemen, in Sana'a. It was where he controlled all his plots from. I went there because I did a documentary for PBS, and we did a documentary on NSA and 9/11. So I went to that house, and we saw it, and that was where the first hint of 9/11 came from. And again, these are all issues that feed into Judge Pauley's decision, the comments of the director of NSA. These are all what I'm about to talk about here is the key excuse for having the metadata program. What happened was in December of 1999, the NSA had been listening to this house for years because it was the house where bin Laden would call to set up his terrorist operations. It's the house where they attacked the U.S., set up the plan for the USS Cole, the attacks on the U.S. embassies and so forth. The NSA was listening to that house. Then in December of 1999, they picked up a communication, and it was from Afghanistan, and it said, send Khalid and Nawaf to Kuala Lumpur for the meeting. So we know that the NSA knows at this point that there's going to be a very big meeting in Kuala Lumpur, where the NSA passes that to the CIA and the other intelligence agencies. The CIA sends people to Kuala Lumpur, and they get the cooperation of the government, the Malaysian government, and they're watching these guys. And then all of a sudden they go to the airport, and they get on a plane, Khalid al-Mihdhar and his partner, Nawaf al-Hazmi, and they fly out of the country. Well, the CIA, being good intelligence people, they figure that they're flying to Bangkok because that's where the plane was going. The problem was they called up the station in Bangkok to alert them, and it happened to be a Saturday and nobody was working. So the two terrorists got off the plane and disappeared into Bangkok. But the CIA did know they were going to the United States because they had a copy of their passport which had the visa in it. So what happened was the two of them flew from, well, they flew from Yemen to Kuala Lumpur, and then Kuala Lumpur they flew to California. And since nobody had been tipped off by the CIA that they were coming, nobody was there to watch them arrive. Well, they went down to San Diego, and they managed to get this house here. It was a house in San Diego. It was owned by somebody, a Muslim in San Diego, and saw two people that needed a place to stay, so he let him stay there. The guy happened to be an FBI informant, which was very interesting. So you have two terrorists that were on their way here. The CIA knew about it, didn't tell anybody, and then they're living in a house that's owned by an FBI informant. Then Khalid al-Mihdhar, his wife was pregnant in Yemen, and so he called her fairly often, at least once a week. And the NSA was eavesdropping on everything in that house in Yemen, everything going in and coming out of that house in Yemen. So what happened was that the CIA wanted information from that house. They wanted to say, well, give us the transcripts, give us what these people are saying. And the NSA wouldn't give the CIA any information that they were picking up from the house. They went up 3 times asking senior officials at the NSA for that information. They wouldn't give it to them. So the CIA ends up building their own listening post to pick up communications from the house. The problem is they're only getting the downlink. They don't have a satellite, so they're not getting the uplink of the communications. So they go back to the NSA and they say, look, we got the downlink, we built our own listening post. Can you just give us the uplink? Because we don't have a satellite and we can't afford one to put up over Yemen right now. And NSA again said, no, you can't have that information. Well, that's one of the key issues right now with, this is another case that's coming up, which I'll talk about in a second. Well, let me just back up to this one for a second. That house there in Yemen is the key issue right now, because in Judge Pauly's decision, he accepted the NSA's argument that NSA, even though for 2 years they were listening to everything going in and out of this house, they weren't able to find out that the calls from that house were going to the house in Yemen. Now, I've followed the NSA since 1982, and has a lot of technology. And I've talked to a lot of whistleblowers, and whistleblowers just can't believe that the NSA is saying that they didn't have the capability to find out where those phone calls were coming from. But that's the NSA's policy. The NSA's policy right now is that they didn't know where those calls were coming from. They were listening to the calls in Yemen, but they couldn't tell that they were coming from San Diego. That's the key point. So Judge Pauly accepted that argument, and that's the argument for metadata. Because the NSA couldn't tell where those phone calls were coming from, then you have to collect everybody's metadata in the United States. So you have it in one place, and then you can go through it. So you don't have another 9/11, but that's their argument. So again, these are things that are somewhat complicated. They're not usable in a soundbite on television, but they're critical to this whole issue of metadata, and it needs more writing about in the journalist community. Because a lot of this, again, whistleblowers I've talked about are saying, are you kidding? You know, we put all this technology out there and you can't tell where a telephone's coming from? Everybody hear of caller ID? But the story's not over yet. There's going to be a third bite of the apple here. So we had the split decision, the judge in New York and the judge in Washington. Well, there's another case coming up. It's called First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles versus NSA. And I actually have played a little role in this case myself. And it's brought by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Again, it's a case that focuses on the legality of the metadata and so forth. But there's another little twist, and they're also focusing on another issue, which I think is very important, and that's the Americans' right of assembly. And the government shouldn't have a right to know every time the Committee for the Republic is meeting here, to get all our phone calls and find out that we're having a meeting, or the NAACP, or any political gatherings or anti-war gatherings. So that's one of the other aspects of this case that makes it a little bit different from the other two. And it should be decided hopefully in the relatively near future. So you'll have these three cases, and then they'll go to the appeals court, and then they'll go to the Supreme Court for a decision. So we're just at the sort of entry position here, but I really do have to, next time I see Judge Leon, I really do have to, for the first time, say he was right. And I'm glad that he was right on this issue here. So what I did was I wrote an amicus, or I actually helped. I taught at Berkeley at one point, and the law students at Berkeley wanted me to help them do an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, for that case, the third case that's going to be coming up. And what we focused on largely was looking back to the Church Committee, for example, in 1975, the Church Committee. And we could show that, look, before the Church Committee, NSA was just running amok. I mean, they had this Operation Shamrock, which was eavesdropping on everybody's telegram coming in, going out, going through the country, millions and millions of telegrams a day and all that. Operation Minaret, eavesdropping on anti-war protesters. It was only when the Church Committee came along and made it transparent, publicized it through their hearings and through their reports, that there was change made, and that was the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the first court to ever put any kind of a leash or any kind of regulation on NSA. And it worked really good for 30 years. I mean, it wasn't perfect. It never turned the government down, but at least it was there. And it did make some, I think it was, I used to make jokes about it, but I think it actually did do a fair amount of good work, and it's certainly better than not being there. So what happened after 9/11, the Bush administration went around the FISA court. Violated the law and just bypassed the FISA court. And then 2.5 years later or so, after the New York Times revealed the program, then they created this thing called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendments Act, which basically just legalized what they were doing in the first place. Now we're at the point where we were at just prior to the Church Committee, where the NSA has run amok. And we need another Church Committee to look at this. I mean, I admire the President's panel because they actually came up with some really good suggestions, but it was just a panel that looked at some of the issues for a month or a couple months or whatever it was, and that's it, and then they're gone. So I think what we really need is a Church Committee to do this. I mean, it's been since 1975. Look at the technology NSA has picked up. Look at the amount of weaknesses that they've created in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And then I was down in Rio back in November, and I saw Glenn Greenwald while I was there, and he showed me one of the documents that he had. And I thought it was very fascinating. This one here was this is just an excerpt from it, but and I've got another slide that actually you could actually read that tells a little bit about what it was. But when I read that, I thought, wow, we're here. We finally arrived at the point we were in 1975 when the government was doing a lot of really bad things. Back then, what they were doing was they were looking for ways to get Martin Luther King, who was considered a radical at the time, and they wanted to discredit him in front of his followers. And one way of doing that was by finding out what kind of sexual activity he might have, and then using that to either blackmail him, to extort him, or basically just discredit him in front of his followers. And that's what this document was. I mean, it basically said the same thing. It was dated just back in October of 2012, and what it argued was that, and the director of the NSA, General Alexander's title was at the very top of it, and it said they look for personal vulnerability. They were looking for personal vulnerabilities, viewing sexually explicit material online, and so forth. A lot can be learned by people visiting porn sites. Besides, it's probably more fun than listen to the North Koreans. So then the idea here is to exploit. I was amazed at the language they use. You know, like nobody would ever see this document, so let's use as vivid language as possible. So then they would exploit these vulnerabilities of character, these radicalizers. And again, they said, we're not talking about terrorists here. We're not talking about criminals. These are people who are radical. And it actually identified the people. I saw the original document when I was down there with Glenn, so I actually saw the names, but I was, I agreed with him that you shouldn't publicize it. But when I saw the names, there wasn't any division between, because at least one of the names I saw was a U.S. citizen, or a U.S. person is what they call it, and others were foreigners. So there wasn't any division. We're only going after the foreigners. It's Americans or U.S. persons and foreigners. And then, it was interesting to me, among the distribution list was the Justice Department and Commerce. I mean, what is this because they're trying to regulate the porn industry or something? I didn't get what the Commerce Department would be getting a top secret document from NSA about eavesdropping on people's visits to porn sites, but there's a lot I don't understand about NSA. So going back, this is what happened back in the bad old days, the 1960s. The FBI's used wiretapping to discover vulnerabilities such as sexual activity to neutralize or target such as radicalizers, including radicalizers such as Martin Luther King. Back then, the idea had come up with J. Edgar Hoover, the longer-serving FBI director. Now it comes from General Alexander, the longest-serving NSA director. It says something about not letting people stay in a job too long. And NSA played a role back in those days, too. It played a role as part of Minaret, eavesdropping on anti-war protesters and so forth. So NSA would pick up the information, some of the information, and pass it on to the FBI. So in terms of reforms now, those are, I couldn't see anything that I really disagreed with on those 46 recommendations that came out from the White House panel. I'm, hearing all these rumors that the president's not going to, he's going to do sort of cosmetic changes tomorrow and not anything really substantive, which would be very disappointing, but actually it goes along with his track record. I mean, he's the guy that tripled the number of people tripled the number of forces in Iraq instead of ending it in the first 6 months. I'm sorry, in Afghanistan. triple the number of forces in Afghanistan when he first got into office instead of ending it in the first 6 months. George Bush had one drone attack in Yemen in 8 years. And Obama has declared war on Yemen. I mean, there's drone attacks going on all the time. And the first attack on Yemen wasn't even a drone attack. It was I think it was December 17th, 2009. That was when he launched his first attack on Yemen, which was very telling. There weren't enough drones in the area. They were all in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But there was a Navy ship. It was either a Navy guided missile cruiser or it was a submarine, one of the two. He used that. And they thought that there were some terrorists down in the really rural part of southern Yemen. So they fired all these cruise missiles at this group in this tiny little village. The cruise missiles happened to be filled with cluster bombs, outlawed in 109 countries. I mean, this is the person I voted for president. I mean, really. Shooting cluster bombs, shooting cruise missiles with cluster bombs at a country we're not at war with, and then missing the target and killing 50 women and children. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, he made a very public phone call to the president of Yemen, thanking him for such a great terrorist operation that he performed, when the president of Yemen, Salih, had nothing to do with it. It was entirely the Obama administration, but Salih had agreed to go along with it. Which gets me kind of to the point I'm making, the point I want to make. We find out a lot of these things, not from the U.S. government, but from whistleblowers. A lot of this came from the material that was leaked by Manning, Chelsea Manning. So what happened was, among the documents he released was a meeting between Petraeus and the president of Yemen, Salih. And at that meeting, which took place a couple months after that attack, and after that attack there were more, there was one on Christmas Eve and other attacks in Yemen. And in that meeting, there was a transcript that was leaked by the Manning documents. And it said they were laughing about it in the meeting, and the president of Yemen said, yeah, I'll keep lying about it. And as a matter of fact, I'm even lying to my own parliament about it. And so Petraeus and Salih had a good laugh about that. So these are the reasons why I really admire whistleblowers, because they tell us the things that we really have to know, rather than the things they want us to know. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating, since I knew a number of the people at the church committee, was they were able to get NSA to come up and name a lot of the people that were targets of their eavesdropping, the anti-war protesters and so forth. There were 1,600 of them. And they actually came out with names, you know, real fearsome people like Dr. Benjamin Spock, Joan Baez, Jane Fonda, people you really have to worry about. Well, there was one name, there were actually a couple names, but one name in particular that they refused to release to the church committee. Despite all the pleading, they never released this one name to the church committee. But that name was finally released. I think it was last September it was released. And here's who it was. Which is why we need another church committee. Anyway, thanks very much. So I'll be happy to take questions, and I think John has a
Good.
microphone.
Do we have Bruce Fine?
It's a fabulous presentation. I think all the audience learned much from the narrative recounting the National Security Administration's beginning. I guess one of the things that James omitted, it was created by a top secret memorandum by Harry Truman in 1952. There wasn't any congressional debate. There was no public debate. It just sort of emerged like Athena from Zeus's head. But I'm sure that Harry Truman thought it would be embarrassed by a discussion.
Well, that's true, yeah. As Bruce was saying, yeah, it's the only agency in the U.S. government that wasn't created by a law in Congress. It wasn't created by hearings. It wasn't created by a bill through Congress. It was created by a top-secret memorandum signed by Harry Truman in 1952 that was, even the Congress wasn't allowed to know about it. So it's the only agency in the U.S. government that was born secret.
Yeah, which is, of course, the opposite of our postulates, is that government must be transparent in order to have government by the consent of the governed. But it seemed very apparent and conspicuous to me that other than a few cameo appearances, really nothing in your narrative, Jim, involved Congress. We have the whistleblowers. But where's Congress? I mean, Article 1?
Well, at least not since 1975.
And so, yeah, and that was just sort of an episodic instance in any event. And we're talking about, as John Henry said, the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Section 6 specifically endows all members with what's called speech or debate immunity. It was exercised by Mike Gravel in the Pentagon Papers, and he read 47 classified volumes of the Pentagon Papers into the record. He was investigated for Espionage Act by the Nixon administration. He claimed...
I think I know where you're getting. Go right ahead and,
in any event,
say it. I know the punchline here.
But the reason for these observations are we can't depend upon our liberties that some brave whistleblowers from time to time will expose the wrongdoing of the executive branch. It needs to be institutionalized, which is the whole reason why you have congressional oversight and the speech or debate clause. And until that's changed, we may get Ed Snowdens from time to time, but it isn't going to change the dynamic unless there's a systematic insistence by the American people in Congress that this be made public. I don't see any of that generation. Now, you ask for another church committee, Dianne Feinstein or Mike Rogers?
Yes.
I mean, it is a joke. If anything, they help the cover-up. And just to show
well, that's what, yeah, exactly. And that was one of the points I usually make, and I should have made it here, was that I'm not asking for a church committee in Congress. I'm asking for an external church committee, a committee that would be like a 9/11 commission, and also one that just doesn't have former government officials on it, one that has a civil libertarian, a journalist, and so forth. But anyway, we got to get other questions too, Bruce. Thanks.
Dorothy, you had a question?
That was my question, which was, who is the Frank Church of 2014?
Yeah, well, that was why unless we could find somebody with the medical ability to bring him back to life and put him back into the Senate, I wouldn't put the Senate, I wouldn't allow the Senate or the Congress to do this committee, because look where, as Bruce was saying, I mean, look where they've come so far. You know, when I've been following this ever since the church committee, with the church committee, they took it upon themselves. Their mission, at least the way they looked at it, was they were the buffer between the American public and the NSA, or the intelligence community, and it's revolved now so that the intelligence committees in Congress feel that they're the protector of the agencies, not the protector of the public. They argue for a bigger budget for the intelligence agencies whenever there's a cut in the budget, or they argue for more freedoms for the agencies. And where were they during the 2.5 years until the Times released the, you know, let the information get out about the warrantless eavesdropping, which came from a whistleblower, not from our overseers in Congress. Yes. Any other questions?
Jim.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Oh, Deborah. Deborah Boardman's a really good friend of mine. She was the lead attorney on the Tom Drake case, and I worked on that case, and it was a tremendously successful case. Tom Drake was a whistleblower from NSA who was charged with 5 counts of espionage for leaking some rather mundane information. I was able to show, with the help of Debbie, that the information they were charging him with was not only unclassified, and they wanted to put him in jail for 35 years. It was not only unclassified, but it was in the public domain and put there by the NSA and the Pentagon. So when it came time for the trial, the prosecution threw the case out and asked them to please just sign this thing agreeing to a misdemeanor with no jail time and no fine. And the judge spent 20 minutes yelling at the prosecutor and the NSA. So it was a really good case. So I appreciated Debbie's work on that.
So, hi, Jim. It's good to see you. Thank you for that.
For embarrassing you, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Slightly, and I'm actually going to take a different role, play devil's advocate a bit, which is driven actually in part by this uncomfortability, this uncomfortable feeling that I have with Edward Snowden, actually. And it's driven in large part by my experience in Tom's case, which is, you know, I've read articles in the Post and the Times that there are millions of documents, well, I guess 1.7 million documents that he took, only a small snippet of which we've seen. And the vast majority of the documents that are in Greenwald's possession, and I presume you saw, have really nothing to do with metadata or spying on Americans. And in fact, one of the slides you showed was a map of the world showing where our malware is. And I don't want to comment on whether we need to know about that, but at what point is Edward Snowden going to be not this glamorous hero, but a thief?
A journalist. Snowden doesn't have the documents.
Well, no, let me just answer. That's a good question, because that's one of the major questions that people have. I mean, the question is, you got 1.7 million documents. We've only seen a little bit. And by the way, Snowden didn't show me all these documents. I was down there. He happened to show me just a couple. Yeah, that's a really good question. What happens to it? I mean, the major questions are, could the Chinese have gotten access to it? Could the Russians have gotten access to it? According to what Snowden says, they didn't get access to it. I mean, speaking in Snowden's defense to some degree, if you're a whistleblower and you're trying to get the documents out, and you don't have time to sort of edit those documents while you're sitting there at your desk at NSA. So the idea was he would pull the documents out and not just to put them up on the internet, but to give them to responsible journalists, and the journalists would go through them. That's what happened with Dan Ellsberg, who's actually a good friend of mine, and he did that. He gave it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we ended up helping to shorten a war that we should never have gotten into. So, yeah, there's no perfect. I don't think he went to whistleblower school. He probably didn't, read how to be whistleblowers for dummies or whatever. So, I give him a lot of courage for a lot of credit for the courage that he had to what he did. I think there's a lot that the government is always saying that, the world's going to come to an end. They said the world was going to come to an end when Yardley wrote The Black Chamber. They said the world was going to come to an end when David Kahn wrote The Code Breakers. They said the world was going to come to an end when I wrote The Puzzle Palace. They say the world's going to come to an end every time I write something, but so far the world's, still pretty good shape, and the main problems we have is getting into wars that we're not supposed to be in. So, and if we don't have whistleblowers occasionally, who may not be perfect people, may make mistakes, then, we're going to have these more wars, and we're going to have more government that we don't want and that we don't know about. So anyway, I'm always happy to debate you, Debbie. You're such a great lawyer. I always feel that I'm up against the greatest challenge, so I appreciate it. Thanks for your question. Oh, yes,
Hi, thanks, Jim. Jeff Steinberg. I wanted to pick up and follow a bit further on the Almidar and Hazmi business, because you probably know that part of this is the subject of a 28-page section of the original joint congressional investigation into 9/11
right.
that was suppressed by President Bush and remained suppressed by President Obama. This section, from what we can derive from other writings and speeches by Senator Bob Graham, who chaired that committee, indicated a line of investigation on Saudi intelligence connections with the two hijackers in San Diego, funding mechanisms, and apparently also the fact that the FBI refused to allow the congressional committee investigators access to the informant who owned the house where these two guys were staying.
Yeah,
And
I know a lot.
maybe you could
I
say
wrote a
more
whole book
about it.
on
Yeah.
9/11. So, but just give me the predicate of your question.
Just further comment, two members of Congress have introduced the bill, Walter Jones and Steve Lynch, calling for every member to read the 28 pages and have it declassified. I wonder what your thoughts are on that dimension of this.
Well, I completely agree, and I actually have a lot of admiration for Walter Jones. Walter Jones, a Republican from North Carolina, and he was the person who put a bill in when we went to war in Iraq to change the name of French fries to freedom fries because the French weren't supporting our war. And then one day he read the book I wrote on Iraq called A Pretext for War, and he completely changed, and he became one of the most vocal anti-war opponents within Congress. So I've always had a great deal of admiration for him for admitting a mistake and then trying to get others to change also. Yeah, it's amazing what's still classified in those reports. I have no idea what it says. I haven't seen anybody leak it to me. I don't know what the Saudi part is. There's a lot of people that have speculated what the Saudi part is. So I don't know. But the committee did a very poor job on the NSA aspect, which I wrote a lot about because they never focused on what the NSA knew and what they didn't know and so forth. And I agree with you that should be released as soon as possible. Sorry, Bill.
Judge Schilling, a comment and a question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Several years ago, I was told that what NSA really meant was no such agency. And
yes, it now stands for not secret anymore.
Yeah. And you might want to ask those who are visiting here to give their comments later on from NSA. But my question is, in light of the situation where the NSA and CIA weren't cooperating before 9/11, and if they had, it might have prevented it, going forward, what do you think would be the proper balance between this kind of data collection and analysis for national security and protecting individual privacy? So what should whatever NSA turns into or other agencies be doing, and how should they cooperate with CIA and others to protect interests while still protecting privacy?
Well, the one problem here is that first of all, I'd like them to at least start telling the truth about how useful some of these programs are. You had the NSA go for years telling Congress how useful the email metadata program was. And it wasn't until Senator Wyden and Senator Udall put their feet to the fire and said, well, come back here and show us where it's been useful. And NSA couldn't do it. And NSA had to shut that program down in 2011, the Internet Metadata Program. And then when we're discussing this telephone metadata program, the director first came out and said there's 54 cases where it helped prevent 54 attacks or something like that. And then it was down to like 32 or whatever. And then all of a sudden we found out he wasn't really talking about the metadata program, the 215 program. He was talking about the PRISM program, and where you knock on the front door of the agency or the company with a warrant or an order from the FISA court. So when it came down to the actual metadata program, it came down to one success. One success. And actually, the deputy director actually admitted this on the deputy director who just left NSA, Engel, admitted it on public radio about a week ago. It was just this one case, and the case was a guy in San Diego who sent $8,000 to some group in Somalia. I mean, it didn't even have anything to do with the United States, but that was their one success for collecting all your telephone records since 2001. That's what I really hope, is that we can starting to understand the useful programs from the useless programs, and to apply not just the standard of some guy in the back room of or woman in the back room of a NSA listening post, but people who are in the civil liberties, privacy community, hear other voices in this debate.
I'd like, sorry. My question is just like about this. Do you think there is willingness in American society, because the narrative in American society to really restrict, to really end this kind of restrict the activities of NSA, considering the speech about this permanent threat of terrorism, like that it ends up always, the narrative that you showed is an NSA that is expanding.
Right, yeah, right? No, it's a good question, because the question is basically, do you think there's any public support for this? I mean, the problem is you're going up against the terror machine, the fear-mongering machine. I mean, how do you argue, if we don't do this, we're going to have another 9/11 tomorrow or whatever? And that's always the problem, this rational, putting a rational, making a rational argument when you're getting irrational arguments from the government, and the fear is the so that's one of the key things, is to try to get I mean, I wish the press would do more of showing the relative nonsense of so much of this fear. I mean, we've had, what, 23 people have been killed from terrorism in the United States since 2011. Half of that was Major Nidal Hassan, the Army major, and the FBI in San Diego have been picking up its conversations with Anwar al-Awlaki. So it wasn't a question that they didn't even know about it. So, you know, it's this, I've always been amazed at the United States, how it's against the law to take a bottle of shampoo onto an airplane, but you could buy as many assault weapons as you want. What sense does that make? So, but it's a good question. Unfortunately, I've got to only answer the mic, because this is being recorded by C-SPAN, so if I answer a question where there's no mic, they won't hear the question. So I have to go with John Henry where the mic is.
My fortune, I suppose. Sam Hussein, I'm with the Institute for Public Accuracy. I wanted to highlight to people we'll be having an event tomorrow to remedy some of the problems with the press, hopefully. We'll have several of the whistleblowers that you mentioned, Binny Wiebe, as well as Russell Tice, will be there immediately following Obama's address. So people can check it out online. It'll be live streamed at 12:30. Obama's speaking at 11. The event will be at, they can go to accuracy.org to get the insights of the whistleblowers immediately following Obama's address. I'd like to ask you a brief question about sort of a pushback on the international scope of it. Certainly, nations spy on each other, but shouldn't we have some kind of infrastructure, some kind of limits on, you know, can the NSA spy on democracy activists in Egypt, for example? Is the delineation between U.S. person and non-U.S. person the most genuinely meaningful one that we want to set up here? Thank you.
Yeah, again, that's another good question. This whole issue doesn't really resonate at all in the United States, and that's what about the rest of the people in the world? I mean, we don't care about any of the people in Germany or France or anybody else. Yes, they have their own intelligence service that's spying, but still, you know, it's a question of sort of digital imperialism in a sense. And I hear that argument a lot. You know, every country spies. We all spy. Every country spies. But every country doesn't have the 9 largest internet companies home-based in their backyard. And when you do have the 9 largest internet companies in your backyard, you can force them to do things that other countries can't do. You can go to Google and you can force them to give you whatever you want. But the NSA goes well beyond that. That's the front door. They also go through the back door. They tap into the fiber optic links between the data centers. So, no, I think that's something that I would like to see at least addressed, is where is this leading us in terms of worldwide surveillance of everybody? And is it rational? We're paying for this, and are we just building the haystack so high that you'll never be able to find a needle? So these are good questions.
Jim, I'm Mark Rotenberg from the Electronic Privacy Information Center. I want to thank you very much for your talk and all your work on this issue. As you know, it was EPIC that brought the original challenge to the NSA telephone record collection program last summer to the Supreme Court. We were supported in that effort by dozens of legal scholars and former members of the Church Committee who agreed that under Section 215 there simply wasn't the authority for the NSA to collect all of the telephone records on American citizens. But what I want to ask you about is the historical significance of the President's speech tomorrow morning. And it seems to me that if we take a step back and think about the significant reform efforts in this area, we recall, for example, the Congress of 1974 post-Watergate that passed the Privacy Act and strengthened the Freedom of Information Act, and the Congress after the Church Committee that established the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Don't you think we have sufficient evidence at this point that points toward comprehensive legislative reform in light of what we know to safeguard privacy in the country?
Well, I certainly do, Mark, and EPIC's a terrific organization. I've been on the advisory board for them for a long time. They're the ones who originally fought NSA during the 1990s when NSA wanted to do a thing called the Clipper chip. And that was where the NSA would force the encryption companies in the U.S. to turn the keys over to NSA for letting them use the back door. The public and the Congress rejected that, largely because of what EPIC was doing. And then we find out from the Snowden documents that it didn't make any difference since they're going around the back door anyway and eavesdropping on it. So yeah, it's a good question. What the problem is, somebody mentioned there isn't any Frank Church in Congress anymore. We've got Dianne Feinstein. And I just don't see an awful lot of momentum in Congress to work on or to actually pass some privacy bills with teeth in it. I mean, I would really like to see that happen. We're living in this, still living in this post 9/11 period, which we weren't living in back in those days. And it's just, as I mentioned, the fear machine, and it gets the it's self-generating. So you get the Congress people who know that they have to go up for re-election every 2 years, and they know that if they vote against a new budget increase for NSA, or they vote for a privacy bill instead, their opponent is going to say, well, my opponent here, he's weak on terrorism, so if you're blown up by the next terrorist bomb, it's going to be his fault. And that serves as a disincentive to these Congress people to push for progressive legislation and falling back on just pouring more money into the intelligence community. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm advisor to EPIC, because I think EPIC does a great job of trying to get these bills passed.
There's been a couple references here, or at least one, to the fact that we have to balance our rights against national security. And that seems how a vigorous effort by a lot of people to reframe the argument or frame the argument that we have to balance these rights, our constitutional rights, versus national security. And it seems lost in that is that, in fact, our Bill of Rights was, as Mr. Henry alluded to at the beginning, really the means for us as a sovereign people versus what we previously were subjects under the monarchy to be the overseers, provide oversight to our government, meaning the malfeasance or misfeasance of government officials. So going back, some of us are old enough to remember the 70s, as you've already talked to, the Army, agency of the Department of Defense, spying on American anti-war activists to suppress that free speech and right to know. Here we have the NSA, again, a DOD agency, doing it on a massive scale worldwide. And the question seems to be, or to me seems to be, why are we willing to relinquish to government officials, military especially, who have a very narrow focus, this right to know that we as American citizens should have, because I think Vietnam was the best example showing that the Army, the military, was wrong and the anti-war activists were right, and they're the ones who managed to keep us from degrading into the same kind of catastrophic failure that the Soviet Union did only 15 years later, because we had that right to know. So where is the outrage, I guess, is my question.
Right, well, yeah, that's that's always the problem, is trying to create outrage. I write books and I write articles and I do documentaries and so forth, so I'm always hoping that we're going to create some momentum for things, but it's hard getting the American public to get energized between issues that don't deal with saving them from the terrorists or saving them from Iraq or saving them, and I don't have the answer to that. I wish I did, but you're 100% right that during the 1970s, the Army actually was used in the United States to spy, to eavesdrop on U.S. citizens. It's another outrage, another reason why the Church Committee was formed. So, again, motivating the public isn't. If I knew the answer to that, I'd be selling toothpaste or something, make millions of dollars. But I don't know how to motivate the public. I just know how to write books and whatever. Yes, Bill.
Jim, I'm curious. You've warned us of the danger of inadvertent release of all of this vast store of information. But to your knowledge, are we intentionally sharing any of this metadata with foreign countries? And if so, do you have any idea of which ones?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. People don't really realize this, but it's not just the NSA. The NSA is just one element of a much larger organization. It's called the UK-USA agreement, or the UKUSA agreement, otherwise known as the Five Eyes. I don't know why they call it the Five Eyes. It should be the 10 ears. But that's what they call it, the Five Eyes, and that's the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. It's basically the same organization, and after World War II, it was a very successful World War II, the code breaking the Enigma machine in Germany, the Purple machine in Japan, and so forth. So the countries wanted to stay together and continue doing their code breaking and so forth. And so what they did was they divided the world up in terms of spheres of eavesdropping capability. So the UK could eavesdrop on Europe very well. The US could do South America. The Australians and the New Zealanders could do the Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. So it's one big organization that does this spying. So everything that's picked up by the United States is shared with those 5 countries. But there's a lot of sharing that goes on beyond that. One of the documents I thought was fairly shocking that I saw from the Snowden release was that the NSA was turning over to Israel all the raw data that the U.S. was collecting. Without ever even going through the having some oversight or overview or something, just turning it over. So that's the problem you have when you have a situation like that. You have the government that collects all this stuff. There's nobody overseeing it, nobody saying you're not allowed to do that. They just give it to whoever they want. I don't particularly want the Israelis to know who I'm calling every day or whatever. Why should they know? So, no, I agree. That's a big problem is where is this data once they collect it? Once they collect it, it's going in this big place I wrote about in Utah called Bluffdale, which apparently is not being a very big success. It's it's $2 million, 1 million square feet, and every time they turn a switch on, one of the servers melts. So they haven't had a lot of luck with that, but that's where supposedly it's going to be stored, and they could share it. Digital information you can share very easily. They'll share it with whoever they want. Norman, yes.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Senator Church, but Senator Church, who was from Idaho, came from a distinctive political culture. His ancestor was probably Senator Bora, who many people will think of as a terrible isolationist, but who in fact was a great opponent of centralized power, governmental tyranny, arbitrary decision. So the question that we've all raised, how come our citizenry isn't more active or more outraged? Or how come the ACLU and protests and there are editorials in the Times and so on, but there isn't a kind of steady, broad-based, popularly rooted protest. And probably the answer to that lies in other features of our political culture, namely the giganticism of our social institutions, the fact that when you sign a contract for a phone, you're signing something away that you're powerless in the face. One is powerless in the face of these very sizable institutions, whether they're big banks or communications companies. And this is apparently, I would suggest that this induces a kind of general paralysis or passivity, which requires real heroism to oppose. And as everybody knows, heroism isn't everybody's forte.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is that's why whistleblowers are so rare, because in a society like this, it's much easier to go along. And if you're in certain areas of society and you're saying that there is no threat to terrorism, people are going to look at you like you're a screaming radical or something like that. When if you actually look at the statistics, the person would be absolutely right, but it's this fear-mongering that goes on. I mean, that is really, to me, the worst part about it is the fear-mongering, and it's not really countered much in the press either. And so what to do about it, I really don't know, but I try in everything I write to sort of indicate the level of risk, and that the level of risk is very small from things like terrorism, when it's very large on our gun control and things like that. So, but anyway, I wish there was some magic solution. I just don't have it.
My question is, earlier you were describing the 54 events whereby they were trying to come up with evidence. Right. Do you have any idea how much money they spent specifically on that program, and how many people are being employed to do nothing, essentially?
Yeah, I have no idea, but NSA's budget just keeps growing. I mean, it was all top secret until the Snowden document came out and said what the budget was. So there's a huge, NSA is the largest intelligence agency in the world. It's 35,000 employees, and you've got the another 15,000 or so that are contractors. So you got all that money and all those people out there, and yeah, that's the big question. What do you get out of it? And it's almost like they're doing it because it's an academic exercise, because we can do it, or we're eavesdropping because we can, so we will. And that's really a problem, and that's why if you have a Senate and House Intelligence Committee that don't hold their feet to the fire, like the Church Committee, the committees, wasn't just church, but there were other committees back in the 70s that did that, you're going to have these programs. Again, as I mentioned, the NSA kept arguing that the internet metadata, the email metadata program, was a roaring success until they were forced by only 2 senators, Udall and Wyden, to put up or shut up, and they couldn't put up, so they had to shut the program down. So, and while I'm thinking of it, just so I can mention it because I forgot it before, but we were talking about, whistleblowers and so forth, and penalizing whistleblowers. Well, where's the penalties in the U.S. government for breaking the law? Where was Clapper? He hasn't even been criticized by the president, let alone indicted. And, how many people from the warrantless eavesdropping operation were ever prosecuted? That was complete violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I know that act inside out. If you have even in a time of war, you only have, I think it was 5 extra days to do warrantless eavesdropping. After that, you go back to the warrant. But nobody ever gets punished. It's this lack of accountability. General Alexander, head of the NSA, he was the equivalent of a captain of an aircraft carrier that just ran into the Rock of Gibraltar. Would a Navy captain still be running the ship? I mean, he's still running the NSA, the worst security breach in U.S. history. So there's no accountability within the administration. You've got to start with accountability before you start getting any reform. How are you going to get reform if you let the same people make all the mistakes, continue making them?
Yeah. I'm from the Government Accountability Project, and we represent Edward Snowden and Tom Drake and Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe and Ed Loomis. And I just wanted to point out that the Congress actually took out of the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act any protections from retaliation for intelligence community whistleblowers, and therefore they're vulnerable to any action the government takes against them or the private corporation. Do you see on the horizon any enhanced protections from reprisal coming from the Congress or the Obama administration?
Yeah, you point out some really important facts there. The fact that the whistleblowers don't have protection, and that's one of the things that the administration keeps talking about. Well, they have these proper channels they can go through. Well, they don't have those proper channels, and I don't see any legislation. I've been watching this for years because that's, my bread and butter comes from whistleblowers. That's how I'm able to write a lot of the things I do. And to give you one quick example here, one of the people that I quoted from in my last book, The Shadow Factory, was Adrian Kinney, who was a employee of, who was an NSA, what they call a voice intercept operator, down at the NSA's huge listening post in the state of Georgia here, where they eavesdrop on a lot of the Middle East communications, remotely through satellites and so forth. She was, among the things that they were doing was eavesdropping on Americans, calling Americans. In other words, journalists or aid workers or Americans who happen to be in the Middle East who happen to call their spouses in the United States and were having bedtime conversations and so forth. And she didn't particularly want to listen to that. She said it was like reading somebody's diary. She didn't want to do it. So she protested all the way up from her little position at the listening post in Georgia, all the way up to the head of the Army Intelligence and Security Command, which ran all that, and his name happened to be Keith Alexander at the time, and that got nowhere. So then she climbed up the ladder on the congressional side and got all the way to Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Leahy, and again nothing happened. So she finally talked to me, and I really asked her to go full face and full name and let me use that, because otherwise the government's going to just say, oh, you're just making it up or whatever. So she did, and it was a very brave act on her part, but she felt very strongly that the government was doing this, and this is the problem that whistleblowers face. They don't have any real protection. We were able to do a few things behind the scenes that got her protection within 2 hours of the time when we came out with my book was on ABC News. Senator Rockefeller, on the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, agreed to hold hearings, or not hold hearings, but agreed to an investigation. And they immediately asked her if she would testify, and she said she would, which made her a witness before a committee. So they couldn't prosecute her without obstructing an investigation of Congress. So you have to do all these things in order to protect sources, but I've never had a source ever get arrested or prosecuted, and I want to keep it that way. But listen, it's been...
Jim, we told C-SPAN we'd quit at 8:15.
Okay.
But there's so many questions out here. Would you stay and answer some questions?
Yeah, I don't want to keep people here who don't want to be here, so if you want to leave,
there are a lot of questions, so...
I'm happy to keep asking them.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So if you have a question, I can Oh, by the way, I think they're selling books out there, and they've asked me to notify you that my books are for sale. It's a capitalist society here. Yeah. I'll send you an email. Somebody wants to bring you in.